Welcome. It's so good to see you here. Always good to see you. I look forward to Wednesdays. And I trust that you do too. When I'm making doctor's appointments or anything, I always say, not on Wednesday. Wednesday is taken. So, I always like to start with a little chuckle. I was thinking about my Texas roots this morning, and I was thinking about this story about two rednecks who went hunting. Billy Bob and Jim Ned are out in the woods hunting when suddenly Jim Ned grabs his chest, falls to the ground, and doesn't seem to be breathing. In a panic, his eyes are rolled back in his head. In a panic, Billy Bob whips out his handy-dandy cell phone, calls 911 and gasps to the operator, "I think Jim Ned is dead. What should I do?" The operator, in a calm, soothing voice, said, "Just take it easy and follow my instructions. First, let's make sure he's really dead." There was a silence, and then she hears bang. I usually can do this with a straight face. All right. Billy Bob comes back on the line and says, "Now what?" You like that one so much, I'll tell you another one. Redneck was driving his car, and he was speeding, and the highway patrolman pulled him over to the side, and he walked up to the window, and he said to the guy, he said, "Do you have an ID?" And the redneck said, "About what?"
One more.
One more? I've got another one. Let's see. Just a minute. Okay. This one isn't about a redneck, but I'll go ahead and tell you anyway. Carl was driving down the street in a sweat because he had an important meeting and couldn't find a parking place. Looking up into heaven, he said, "Lord, take pity on me. If you find me a parking place, I will go to Mass every Sunday for the rest of my life and give up my Budweiser." Miraculously, a car backed out and a parking place opened up right in front. Carl looked up again and said, "Never mind, I found one." The what? They are. They're my relatives. Oh, yeah. I miss them. Okay. Well, many years ago, in 1971, Mike and I moved with our one-year-old daughter to Denver, Colorado, and actually specifically Littleton, which you've all heard of. We had this brand new house in this neat little neighborhood. We were like the first ones on our part of the street. And soon everybody else moved in. It was a neighborhood of young families, little children that ran up and down the streets. It was just a pretty picturesque picture of suburbia. And we lived there for 5 years. And then we moved to Montana. 25 years later, we went back. And we drove to our beautiful little neighborhood, kind of expecting it to look the way it looked when we drove out 25 years before. And you can imagine it had all changed. The trees that were little and fresh had grown up, and that would sound like a good thing, but it just looked crowded. There were junk cars in the driveway and on the street. The yards were not taken care of. It had just gone downhill. It didn't look anything like we had left it. And it was very disappointing and disheartening that the picture we had in our minds no longer fit the reality. I thought of that when I thought of Nehemiah, and I thought of the Jews returning to Jerusalem after the Babylonian captivity. When they went back and found Jerusalem in ruins, it had to be very disappointing and very disheartening to them. A little background: when God instituted, years and years before, generations before, when God instituted the Jewish nation made a covenant with them, and God said, I will be your God if you will follow my statutes and follow my documents and be my people. And of course, God was very committed to following his end of the bargain, but the problem was it was a dual covenant because the Jews had their part as well. The Jews had to live up to that and make their God the God and live up to the kind of virtue that God required of them. And we all know that they didn't. When King Jehoiakim reigned, and this was after King David, when King Jehoiakim reigned, he was an evil king, and he led the Jews down the path of wickedness. They forgot their God. God sent Jeremiah to warn them and say, if you don't get straightened out, there's going to be a problem. Jerusalem is going to be desolate, and you're going to be shipped off. They paid no attention, and sure enough, as Jeremiah had prophesied, it happened. In 605 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came in with his troops. They laid siege to Jerusalem, and the siege lasted a year. At the end of the year, the town was in ruins. The temple had been destroyed, and they carried off the items, the treasures from King Solomon's beautiful temple. They carried them back to Babylon and put them in Nebuchadnezzar's temple, signifying that his God was more powerful than the God of the Jews. In addition to that, they burned all the gates, they tore down the walls, they took thousands and thousands captive and took them back to Babylon, leaving only the most weak and poor and infirmed in the city of Jerusalem. It was a sad picture. When Nebuchadnezzar got the people in, he set about to have them assimilate into the Babylonian culture and the Babylonian gods. And this was the time, you'll remember the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they refused to bow down, and then and they threw them in the fiery furnace. And you remember the king looked in and said, hey, I thought there were just 3 guys in there, and now I see 4. And of course, we know that was Jesus Christ in there with them, honoring them for their commitment to him. And then many years later, of course, there was Daniel in the lion's den, and the way that God shut the jaws of the lion, and Daniel was safe. It was exciting stories, but this was while they were in Babylon. Jeremiah had prophesied that the captivity would last 70 years, and it lasted exactly that. But this time, King Cyrus of Persia had come in and had overrun Nebuchadnezzar, so that now the land that was Babylon was now Persia. And King Cyrus miraculously told the Jews they could go back home. It was 70 years after they had come there, and so that's 2 generations almost. So all of the Jews who were in, or 99% of the Jews who were in Babylon, had never seen Jerusalem. They had only heard the stories of the great and wonderful city. And they had, many stayed. Many didn't bother to go back because Babylon was their home. They were born there and they had spent all of their lives there. But some 50,000 Jews returned to Jerusalem. And when they got there, I can imagine how disappointed they were. They had no doubt heard the stories that the city was in ruin, but they'd also heard the stories of the grand temple and the wonderful city and the gate and the walls that surrounded the wonderful city. And when the 50,000 arrived back, it just wasn't like the stories that they had been told. So when they got there, then the deal was they had to start to build their own homes and reassemble their lives. And the one thing that needed to be done was the temple needed to be rebuilt, Solomon's wonderful temple. But they kind of didn't get around to it. They would start it and then they would stop, and it was a back and forth deal. And to make a long story short, God raised up Haggai, the prophet, to get the crowds, get the people organized, and they did rebuild the temple. It wasn't nearly as grand or glorious as the original one, but it was the temple where God could dwell. That happened, they finished it about 20 years after they arrived back into Jerusalem. So, that is, we have set the scene. Now it's some 70 years later after the temple had been rebuilt, and we're back in what was Babylon and now is Persia, and we come to this guy named Nehemiah. And Nehemiah was, obviously, he didn't go back with the Jews. He wasn't even alive when the Jews went back to Jerusalem. He wasn't even probably alive when the temple was rebuilt. He was in Persia, and he was a cupbearer to the king. What that meant was that he was a servant, and specifically, his job was to take the king his wine when he wanted it. But more than that, he had to make sure that the wine was safe and not poisoned. So he drank the wine, and then if he didn't die, then they assumed it was okay for the king to drink. And so that was evidently his sole responsibility, or his chief responsibility, was to take the king his wine. And so we get to the book of Nehemiah. It's written in first person, and so he tells us the story of how he got involved. In Nehemiah chapter 1, he tells the story about some travelers came from Judah and came to Persia, and so he inquired, because he still recognized the God of his fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who had carried the Jews out of Egypt, and he was still interested in his ancestry. And so he asked the travelers who came, he said, "How is it going in Jerusalem?" And this is the answer he got. They told him, "The survivors who are left from the captivity in the province there are in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire." That was not the message, I'm sure, that he had hoped to get. The walls were still down. The people were in great reproach. Nobody was organized. Nobody was worshiping God. And so let's see how Nehemiah responded. Well, first of all, let's see how he could have responded, how maybe we would have responded. How he should have said, he could have said, "Oh, that's too bad. Someone needs to do something about that." Or he could have said, "Well, I'd like to help, but I'm 1,000 miles away. But I'll pray that someone will take it on." Or he could have said, "Rebuilding the wall would take an army of men plus all the construction materials, and I have no way to get any of that." He could have said, "I'm a cupbearer. What do I know about building a wall?" And he could have said, "You know what, that's really sad, but not my problem. If they're there and they're not doing anything about it, well, let them suffer the consequences." But let's see how Nehemiah really did respond. "So it was, when I heard these words," he said, "that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven." So Nehemiah made this thing a matter of prayer. And I don't think he was praying that God would raise up somebody. I think he was actually offering himself. If you could use me, then I'm available. So he thanked God for returning the Jews to their homeland as he had promised. And then he prayed that God would give him success in what he was about to do. So let's see what he was about to do. He said, "It came to pass," this is the beginning of chapter 2, "and it came to pass in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before." I had never been sad in his presence before. That's significant. It's significant because kings typically required that their servants all be happy around them. They didn't want to get involved in their personal problems. They didn't care. The people around them were just supposed to act like they were thrilled to death. There was nothing they'd rather do than be there serving the king and make him happy. That's all that was required of them, was that they have a happy face. But for the first time, Nehemiah went in with a sad face. It was an offense that sometimes cost the servant his head. They weren't getting around. So now you see why he prayed about it before he went in. So Nehemiah had never been sad in the king's presence before. And so let's see how King Artaxerxes responded to that. Verse 2, "Therefore the king said to me, why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart." So I became dreadfully afraid. He was in a bad spot. I became dreadfully afraid, and I said to him, why should my face not be sad when this city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste and its gates are burned with fire? And the king said to me, what do you request? There's an opening. Very next line. So I prayed to the God of heaven. I prayed to the God of heaven before I get any further into this. He wanted God's blessing, and I think he was probably praying for God's boldness. And so the next thing he said was, I ask that you send me to Judah, the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. He asked for the impossible. He asked for a leave of absence. Not only that, King Artaxerxes seemed not fuss about it. He seemed to be agreeable to it. So then he kind of got a little more bold, and the next thing he said was, and you know what? While I go, how about if you write me letters to all the governors of all the provinces that I'll be passing through and guarantee me safe passage on our way? And so the king still seemed okay. So Nehemiah got a little more bold, and he said, and you know what? I'm going to need wood to rebuild all those 11 gates. How about you send a letter to King Ashrath and have him provide me all the wood I need to rebuild those gates? Could you imagine? He goes in, a lowly servant, and he's asking for the sun, the moon, and the stars, basically. And King Artaxerxes not only supplied all that, but he gave him an army to travel with him. And so they left and headed back to Jerusalem, 1,000 miles, which is about the same as from here to Albuquerque on foot. He's sending back to perform this task, and they had safe passage. He gave the letters to all the kings and all the provinces they passed through, and they made it safely back to Judah. You can see God's hand in something that never would have happened without it. So upon arriving, Nehemiah was there 3 days, and then he went out at night, and he inspected all the city wall, and he inspected the gates that were all burned and torn down. And then he called the people to him, and he said to them, you see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach. I mean, this guy was an outsider, you know. He was a trespasser. He'd been there 3 days. And then he wants to come in and say, okay, guys, let's all rally around and let's all rebuild this, because I know you've been here 90 years and you haven't bothered to do it, but now's the time, and God sent me, and so let's get it done. And surprisingly, that's exactly what happened. He rallied the people, and the work began. However, guess what? There were those who were opposed to him rebuilding the wall. Their names were Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem. I mean, you know, anybody with the name of Sanballat has to be trouble. During the time that the Jews were out of Jerusalem, other tribes came in and occupied it. You know, it was kind of like a free city. They were gone. Let's move in and take advantage of what's left. And so they did not want the Jews to come in and rebuild their culture and rebuild their worship of God. They wanted to keep it the way it was. The same had happened when they were trying to rebuild the temple. There were people who came in and opposed it, but they got it done. And so these guys, Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, opposed them. Isn't that the way it always is? Anytime, you know, sometimes we think we're going to do something right, and then the first thing you know, there's a problem. You know, there are people who come in and they criticize and they ridicule and they tell you that you can't, or they tell you that you shouldn't. There's always opposition. And so what is our part? You know, do we say, well, I guess they're right. I guess I really can't do this. I guess I didn't hear God correctly. Or do you bush ahead? Well, you can imagine, of course, that Nehemiah didn't take their threats. He didn't take their opposition to heart. What he did was he got organized. And there were 11 gates that needed to be torn down. And so families volunteered to rebuild gates, one family per gate. And then other people volunteered, and they would take a section of the wall, and that was their project. They would take a section of the wall to rebuild, and then it all had to be connected. And then when it got it all done, then the wall would be finished. But in the meantime, there was the opposition. And these three guys even got other countries, other tribes to come together and try to stop them. They threatened violence. They said, the wall's going to fall down and we're going to knock the wall down. And so Nehemiah had half of the workers stand with swords and guard 24 hours a day. And then he had the other half of the workers who were doing the actual work in order to complete the wall. The Jews responded also by praying to God. They prayed to him night and day that the guards would be able to hold and that the opposition would not be victorious. Notice also that Nehemiah did not say to the people, this is God's wall, and if God wants the wall complete, then he'll just have to protect us, and we're tired, let's go home and go to bed, and we'll leave the wall to God to protect. He didn't do that. He said, let's get organized. Let's have a strategy. Let's do everything we know to do to ensure the success of this project, and then let's pray to God that the strategy works and that he will protect the wall, knowing that we have done all that we can do. And so the work continued. The wall was complete in a record-breaking 52 days. It was 2.5 miles long, 40 feet high, 6.5 to 8 feet wide, and there were 11 gates that had to be rebuilt. Amazing. This was the same wall that surrounded Jerusalem when Jesus walked the streets there. And it lasted until the city of Jerusalem was overtaken in 70 AD. This was the same wall. Interestingly, in 2007, there was an excavation, and the remains of the wall were found. And Henry was nice enough, he found us 3 pictures of the walls that they excavated in 2007. Let me get out of the way so you can see them. I'm probably in somebody else's way. There's one, you see, very rough. But you imagine, workmen one by one. They didn't have cranes and they didn't have, drag lines or anything else. They piled those things up one by one. And there's another one, you see the lady on the wall in the previous one. It kind of gives you an idea, of how massive it is. And then there's another shot of the wall that they built, 2.5 miles long in 52 days. Incredible. So we look at this, and we always have to say, so what? So what? It's just so much Jewish history, and, it's a nice story about what they did back then. Or, I submit, I think there's some things that we can learn from it today. Number one, when God shows us a need, we should consider that maybe he wants us to be the one that is part of the solution, not somebody who needs to do something about that. When God lays a need on our hearts, I think he wants us to do something in order to get it solved, to either to do the work ourselves or to rally people and get something done. But if he's given us a burden, then I think we can pretty much expect that we maybe are part of the solution. Being a senior is always a handy excuse not to do something. I'm too old, or let's let the young people do it, or I'm retired, I don't want to be committed to anything. And who am I? I'm just one person. Nehemiah was just one person. And look what he did when he partnered with God. I think about Harry Hooper, sweet Harry, he was 92 years old. So, one day I think he got out of the hospital and he came and was greeting out front because that's what God had called him to do. And he didn't let age or the fact that he had difficulty walking, nothing could stop him from being here on Wednesday afternoon and for greeting on Sundays at church. I think he's such an inspiration for us. I think about Sharon Flack. Many of you know Sharon. who does the after-school Bible study program. She's in her 80s. I don't know how old she is. Maybe some of you do. And she could have retired 20 years ago and nobody would have thought anything about it. But she sees that need and she has a heart for these children to bring them to the Lord. And so she's like the ever-ready bunny. You know, she just keeps on going. And there's so many more. Some of you are in that same category, that even though we're older, doesn't mean we don't have something to offer, and that God doesn't still want to use us. When we make ourselves available, God can use us in many ways. And so I would ask you today, are you available? Are you available? Number 2, as sure as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, when we are active in doing what God calls us to do, there's going to be opposition. There will be naysayers and criticism and scoffers who will tell you you can't, or tell you you shouldn't, or tell you that it can't be done. But remember Nehemiah's reaction when Sanballat and Tobias and Geshem came against him. He prayed about it, and in spite of the opposition, he made a strategy and he completed it. It seemed to almost make him that much more determined instead of deterring him from the mission that God had set him on. And number 3, if God calls us to it, he will provide everything we need to accomplish it. There's a cliche that I love. God doesn't call the equipped, but he equips the called. He arranged for Nehemiah's leave of absence. He assured Nehemiah's safe passage. He provided the materials for rebuilding. Is that amazing? And the manpower to do the work. And I also provided the protection from the enemies. All too often, when we think God may be calling us to do something, we back off because we think the job is too big for us, or we're not qualified, or we're not capable. Well, and usually we say things like, well, I could never do that, or I don't have the skills, or I don't have the resources, or the time, or the personality. I think I must have heard wrong. You must have meant to say it to somebody else because I'm not the person. I'm convinced that our perception of God and what he can do is too small. Remember, Nehemiah prayed every step of the way and what God accomplished through him. Speaking of our God being too small and praying, I heard a story once about a preacher who died and went to heaven, and St. Peter was showing him all over heaven, and he opened this one room to this big storehouse, and it was absolutely packed full of chairs. All the way to the top, you know, everywhere you looked, there were chairs. And the preacher stood there and said, wait a minute, we had a revival in my church one week, and I needed chairs. People were standing in the aisles, and they were standing at the windows, and you have all these chairs, why didn't you send me chairs? And St. Peter said, you didn't ask. I think that's us sometimes. God has all of these resources, but we don't make ourselves available, and we don't ask. The name of this message was Any Old Bush Will Do. Any old bush, and I don't mean George or George W. I'm talking about the bush, of course, at Moses' time, when God ignited that bush and ignited Moses into action to free the people from Israel. It was just an ordinary bush, but God ignited it. And I'm suggesting today that we can just be any old bush, and God can ignite us. We underestimate our God. We sing, you are holy, all hail the power of Jesus' name. There is none like you, but do we act like it? Do we believe it? So what is it today? I'm going to get personal now. What is it today that you think God may be calling you to do? Maybe he wants you to rebuild a broken relationship. Maybe he's calling you to serve at church or in this seniors ministry. Maybe you have a message that he wants you to share. Maybe he wants you to share the gospel with a relative or a friend or a neighbor. And he keeps tapping you on the shoulder, but still you procrastinate. Perhaps he's calling you to phone shut-ins and encourage them, or take them to the grocery store. He's tugging at your heart. Are you responding? When God calls you to a mission, it may be something seemingly huge and impossible, or something as simple as reaching out to a neighbor. There is an old song that I love that says, If just a cup of water he places within your hand, then just a cup of water is all that he demands. Whether it's a big thing or whether it's a small thing, if God asks you to do it, then that's exactly what he wants us to do. Sometimes the smallest gesture can have the biggest impact. So back to the songs we sang today. And John, by the way, thank you for preaching my message, because the little story you told went right along with this. We started out with Jesus calls us. Are you listening, or are you hoping that he doesn't? When I was growing up, I had a cousin just my age. We went fishing with the whole families went fishing. Jeannie sat on the shore with her fishing pole in her hand and her line in the water for about an hour. And finally she said, I hope one doesn't get on my line. And I think that's kind of the way about God sometimes. We think, man, I hope he doesn't call me. I hope he calls somebody else. And so I would ask you today, Jesus calls us. Are you available? The next song we sang was Lead On, O King Eternal. And so once he calls us, are we ready for him to lead? And are we ready to follow him into what he calls us to? And the third song we sang was Open My Eyes. And so are we, and John tickled me with the cataracts. We got cataracts and hearing aids, and open my eyes and open my ears. But are we ready to listen to God and to see the opportunities that he has placed right before us? And then finally, I surrender all. Do we surrender to God's plan, to what we hear him calling us to do? We said just any old bush will do. There's this thing you may have seen or heard before about who God used in the Bible. And so I'd like to read these. Eve believed in Satan. Adam blamed God for his own failure. Abraham tried to pass his wife off as his sister 2 times. Sarah laughed at God. Isaac was gullible. Rebekah played favorites with her sons and resorted to trickery. Jacob was a liar. Leah was not pretty. Joseph was a braggart. Moses had a speech impediment. Aaron and Miriam became judgmental and critical. Rahab was a prostitute. Elijah was afraid. Naomi was depressed. Jonah ran from God. Gideon was inadequate and untrained. Balaam had to get the word of the Lord from a donkey. Samson was a womanizer. David wrote 4 of the 10 commandments within a few weeks. Jeremiah was timid. Zacchaeus was too small. Martha felt sorry for herself. The Samaritan woman had 5 husbands and was living in sin. Paul had a thorn in the flesh. John Mark went AWOL. Timothy was too young. And my personal favorite, John the Baptist ate bugs. If God can use these people, I love it that Scripture always, he doesn't sugarcoat anything. It's not that all these people are saints and they're all perfect and they all get the blessings of God. God used who he could, who was available, and and he saw purpose in people that maybe nobody else saw purpose in. And so today I would ask you to go out and ask God to show you how you can be a blessing to others today, how you can be in the King's army, and how you can make a difference. And then open your ears and be willing for Jesus to lead you into what it is that he's calling you to do. Thank you.